that we're going to do whatever we can to stay somewhere in the middle because we don't want to be labeled. But what happens is the pressure that people feel internally to create this constant balance of scales says that one side has to maximize their sins while the other side minimizes that. And let me explain it this way.
Kingdom and culture.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Kingdom and Culture, and I am Pastor Nathan Hurst, and I'm here to hopefully connect with you on a really important topic that I think is paramount for the church and where we're at today. And it's the idea of the church and how it's begun to swing a little left, or I would say away from biblical standard principles and more progressive over the last couple years. I would say the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a dynamic shift from the church, especially here in the United States. And we've seen that shift actually happen in other countries. You can go to some of the European countries, France, Germany, or even the UK and see an even more dramatic shift. But I believe there's some principles to why and how that happens, and something we can see played out here in the United States in lifetime. So the first thing I wanted to cover was the idea of a political shift in the debate process that we have. So we used to have debates, political debates, based on not necessarily the morals of each party. The parties had kind of a standard moral within the country, within the structure. Here in the United States, the parties used to be similarly aligned morally. But over time, that's changed greatly. And in fact, the discussion used to be more about how are we going to spend the money? Where's the best place to allocate resources for the budget? How do we take in taxes? How much is too much to tax? These used to be the conversations that we had politically, but the moral and the shift started to create a huge divide. This political debate started to shift where the moral divide between the parties became more and more real. See, there's one party, particularly right now, that is all for the castration of children. They would be all right with saying, if you decide to be another sex, if you decide you're living in the wrong body, you want to affirm a gender that's not the gender that God gave you, that is yours based on your birth, that you can now have these surgeries, or if not surgeries, you can have these chemical procedures that ultimately for many kids end up in permanent damage of their bodies, or we don't even know, to be honest, with how far that's going to go. That's a moral divide that we're seeing in our country, that one party is all for it and one party is totally against it. Or we could bring up the abortion, actually believing that the murder of unborn children is a problem and that we shouldn't be for it for any reason whatsoever. And that has become another moral divide, a huge moral divide. It's like there's one party, or one, I don't even want to say party, but there's one faction that is drifting far and far away from God, from nature and the God of nature. And because of that, these parties become, or these factions become polar opposites of each other. And that moral divide grows farther and farther apart. And then you have this comparison between both sides where the one side says to the other, you have sexual immorality and so do we. And so therefore we have to bring ourselves to this middle, this consternation in the middle, because you're bad and we're bad, or you're worse than we are. Your sexual immorality is worse than ours. And so therefore you're worse off than ours. And it becomes this compromise on both sides as well, where there's this, we'll deal with a level of sexual immorality, or even on the one side, on the right side, they've changed their viewpoint a little bit on abortion. And that's even declined a little bit. And so because of that, there's this pressure to stay neutral from the church. So the church has decided that we're going to do whatever we can to stay somewhere in the middle because we don't want to be labeled. But what happens is the pressure that people feel internally to create this constant balance of scales says that one side has to maximize their sins while the other side minimizes that. And let me explain it this way. So the one side, they'll focus on someone like a Donald Trump figure. Now, whether you love him or hate him, there's definitely some issues with his personality. There's definitely some issues with his past morally. And because of that, they'll majorly focus on Donald Trump. Look at all the moral failings here, or look at all the issues with his personality here. And then they'll minimize things, like I said before, the castration of children. Well, it's not that big of a deal. This child just wants to live out their true, authentic selves, and so we should just allow that. When we don't even know really what some of these chemical processes will do to their body. We don't have long-term evidence of that. We don't even want to talk about the fact that there's a level of indoctrination there that's happening even in the school systems, that behind the parent's back, this child's giving the right or even all of the tools necessary to transition socially. And then it makes it one more step easier for them to transition physically, even when the child isn't even of age. And so we're minimizing one set of sins and maximizing another set of sins to try to balance out the scales. And to be honest, it never really balances itself out. And this is a strategy that you can see implored by, I would say, the far left or the left leaning, those who are more progressive, the Christians and even political side, to force countries to go more to the left, and I would say away from fundamental Christian principles. It's one thing that the left has figured out that they can do, that they can just keep pulling hard to the left and Christians will go incrementally. And the reason being that they want to maximize one set of sins and minimize another set of sins. So maximize what the right is doing and make it sound like it's the worst in the world, and then minimize some of these other factors. And it can happen on both sides, and it has. But the point is that it's this strategy that's designed to drift us farther and farther away from biblical principles and to be more and more progressive. And it selectively highlights, again, certain sins. You maximize the idea of Trump's mean tweets while you minimize the idea of abortion and murdering children, killing babies in the womb. Like, there's a huge difference there. One is not on the scale as the other, but that's what's happened because there's a fear of being partisan that the church is living under, and that I would say the church has lived under in other settings, like, again, some of these European countries. One of the real issues that we're having here is that on the one hand, there are some really bad, wicked things happening over here. And I'm not saying there aren't bad and wicked things happening over here, but the moment that you address them, you're automatically labeled. You're automatically labeled as someone who's being partisan. Or even if you say, you know what, I just believe that one group is a better vehicle for me to pursue justice in society, then all of a sudden you're labeled as a Christian nationalist if it's not on the left side. Christians may have to choose one side, not necessarily because they're being partisan, but because fundamentally, to the core of a Christian ethic, one side lines up where the other doesn't. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And this accusation is the tactic where we have this push now. If for one reason or another you look partisan, then the accusations start to fly. See, you don't actually have to be partisan. All you have to say is, I might vote for this group or for that guy because I think it's a better option. And instantly you're judged as ultra MAGA. And again, it becomes maximizing of the sins on one side while minimizing the sins on the other side. And the moment you touch the sins on the other side, then you're pushed off into one set of partisan roles and you're automatically demonized. And that's the tactic of accusation. The Bible actually tells us that the devil himself is the accuser of the brethren. This is a tactic that's been going on for a very long time. And I'm surprised the church hasn't become a little more well aware of this tactic. It's an accusational thing that forces us, because we don't want to be labeled. We don't want to be looked as the bad guy. Again, the fear of labels. We don't want to be looked at as the group that's siding with, the would-be misogynist, or we don't want to be the group that's siding with someone who has some indictments behind his name. We don't want to be that group, so we kind of drift towards the middle. And what happens is the left on the negative side, on the sinful side, drifts farther and farther away from godly principles, and I would say farther and farther and farther away towards the left, more progressive social and theological principles, and therefore the church has to follow, or they are at risk of being labeled. And that's continually what is happening in the church. Christians flinch for the fear of being accused, of being labeled. We want to be kind of in the center. We want to appeal to all people. But now that want of Christianity to be somewhere in the middle, to be someone who can be accepted by both sides, has now become the tactic that's used to ruin the reputation. So if you point out sins on one side, then all of a sudden you're labeled. You're the one that wants to follow that misogynistic leader. You're ultra MAGA. You're someone that would be okay with others abusing others or cutting away needed infrastructure like school lunches or something like that. You're automatically siding with those people, and that might not even be your political point of view. That might not even be something that you land on politically, but because you can't go along with abortion at will or even up to the point of birth, or you can't go along with the idea that, children can choose their gender. Never mind the fact that they can't get a tattoo, they can't drive, they can't vote, they can't drink alcohol, but at age 3, they know what gender they want to be. And we can fill them full of hormones and watch them follow a surgical process in order to choose and affirm that gender. The moment you speak out against it, hey, I think that's too far, then you're automatically labeled. And that's that tactic, that accusation tactic that's worked so well to pull the church towards the left, towards that progressive state. It's a strategy. It's a strategy that's gone literally around the globe, and it's worked very well in other countries. And it's starting to work, or it was starting to work, until major pushback happened here in the United States. And this is a major failing that I see coming to the church. That's the world, the society at large has figured out how to game us. They figured out that there's something they can do to control the narrative, and they can push us more towards the middle, more towards progressivism, or farther away from biblical values, standardized biblical values that have been around for generations. Again, because we don't want to be labeled, because we don't want to be seen as that group, because we don't want to be put off as one of them. Now we start incrementally to devolve down that road, and we don't hold those basic fundamental truths of Christianity. And I'll be honest with you, it's something that I see even in the pastorate, the group of pastors that I have community with. There's some folks here locally that I get to talk with every month. A group of pastors get together from all different walks of life and different denominations. And you can definitely tell there's some folks in the group who, based on their theological background and based on this need to be in the middle, to not want to upset anyone, that anyone who sides with, let's say, a Donald Trump is automatically a Christian nationalist. And they kind of minimize the idea of someone on the left. They're like, well, the brother so-and-so, he might be a Democrat, but, he's one of the good ones. Well, I don't know. What does that mean? Is he for the castration of children? Is he okay with, killing babies in the mother's womb? Is he that kind of Democrat? Or are you saying like he's an old school Kennedy Democrat? He's someone that, man, wants to have social programs, a social safety net for folks, and maybe wants to tax a little differently than I would, a tax bracket that would change a little differently than others. What are we actually talking about when we say, well, I got a brother over here and he's on the left side, but he's a good guy. But anyone that sides on the right side, they're ultimately ultra MAGA, and they sided with the abuser Trump. See, that's what I mean by minimizing the sins on one side while maximizing the sins on the other. And this is, again, it's a tactic that I see working, that is moving the church more and more and more progressive. And this is where I see, honestly, a fundamental breakdown in our country, a sense of shared values. Even if those shared values aren't on the same religious principles, at least we have a sense of shared values. Now, I believe, because of my background, I believe because of my study of history, that this nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. I believe in those principles, that they work, that they are the guidepost for what we have seen work in this country, and we've seen work in most democratic countries, and we've also seen the failings of when they walk away from these Judeo-Christian principles. I think it's what's made the West so strong and so wealthy. I mean, remember, we live in the wealthiest country in wealthiest time the world has ever seen. And there's a reason for that. We've set things up in a way that we're God honoring from its foundation. And the farther that we walk away from that in our political sense, the farther we walk away from that in our churches, the farther that we walk away from that in our theological beliefs, the more and more progressive we become. And I know folks don't like that word, but I don't know whatever word to put on it. It's the word they use to label themselves. More and more progressive when we drift farther and farther away from biblical principles, from true scriptural adherent principles. And when that happens, the church as a whole starts to move farther and farther away from its foundation. That's why the progressive church has won in other countries. That's the tactic. These tactics I'm talking about today, these tactics are what have been used to actually erode the foundation of the church in Europe, erode the foundation of the church in areas like France or Great Britain. And unfortunately, we're seeing a movement in the United States. Now, I think we're a different breed of people. I think based on our Judeo-Christian principles that are founded in documents like the Constitution, that we will ultimately win the battle. I actually believe that the church ultimately wins the battle. I'm not one of those guys who's such a pessimist that believes that the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket and that we're never going to get out of that hell on earth unless we're rescued by some secret rapture. No, I actually believe that Jesus was true. He said the gates of hell will not prevail against my church, but the church has to stand her ground. The church can't give in. You and I as the church, not the church, the institution, not the church and just the pastorate, but you and I as the church, individual members of the church have to stand the ground. That doesn't mean that we're always going to align with one political party or another. There may be points where we defer from the political party that we may have voted for because we're adhering to a scriptural precedent. But by far, the principles that we live under must fall under the Bible. Only the Bible, the scriptural principles that we should be adherent to should also be how we vote. And sometimes that means we vote for a candidate that we don't necessarily like, but who represents, based on party and based on the way they govern, someone who would uphold biblical principles. The fundamental biblical principles that the Bible's focused on the most, and I would say that the top few, would be one, obviously, to worship freely. We have to have the ability in this country to worship freely. Secondarily is the family. The family, well, I would say secondarily is life. Then after, maybe life's number one after worship, but the sanctity of life. We're not going to put them in order because I'm going to get it wrong. So we'll say sanctity of life, the ability to worship freely. Family. Family is important. The nuclear family, the traditional Christian family, one man, one woman, united under God for a lifetime, that grow up kids, and that sexual identity is tied right into that. That we have a defined sexual identity and it comes from God. We don't get to decide what that is. And then we could say Israel is on there as well, that this landmass means something, and that the history of Israel means something, and that God's people come out of that people group, and that we are grafted into as Christians. These are principal things that matter. And then later on, we see other things that come into play, like how we treat the poor, how we actually deal with refugees. What do we do with that? Like, how are we kind neighbors to those who need help? Well, we do have a place for that in this country. It doesn't mean we just open our borders and anyone comes in, but it does mean that we treat people well. So there are principles, core principles, that are foundational for Christian believers that have become eroded through this progressivism that's happened in culture. And we've allowed it to happen because the church is so afraid of being labeled. Listen, we got to get away from that. It's Ash Wednesday here. And for Ash Wednesday, folks will put that ash on their forehead, that cross on their forehead, labeling them for all of their community, their friends, their family, their coworkers, to see that they have that cross on their head, that they are a Christian, and that they're now moving into the season of Lent, which is a very important season for the Christian people. And it's something that I wish us Protestants would do more of, is to have that statement of faith just out there for the world to see on our forehead that says, listen, I'm a follower of Jesus, and I want to explain what that looks like, even with my practical everyday life. So as Christians, we need to take that stand. We need to not be afraid of being labeled. If the label doesn't fit you, then tell the world it doesn't fit you. But don't be afraid that there's going to be a label if you stand strong in your beliefs. It's bound to happen. Anyway, I hope you got something out of it today. Hopefully we can right the tide, we can turn the ship, and we can maybe not be so succumb to the enemy's tactics, and that he would easily push us away from what God's called us to. Maybe we can get back to that place of standing strong for scriptural biblical principles, even when it flies in the face of either party, because we know what's right. We're not afraid of the label that might get thrown at us. We're not going to minimize sin on either side. We're going to recognize it for what it is, but we're not going to maximize one set of sins just to minimize another. Man, hopefully you got something out of this today, and we'll see you next time.